What you're watching right now isn't just a news headline, but it's a page of history turning in real time, and most people are still asleep to what it actually means. 5 US military cargo planes landing in Israel. Think about that for a second. Not one, not two, 5. And this isn't happening in a vacuum. This is happening right in the middle of one of the most strategically significant moments the Middle East has seen in decades. You have Donald Trump back in the White House. You have Benjamin Netanyahu holding one of the strongest political positions he has ever held in Israel's history. You have Iran being struck, its nuclear facilities targeted, its military pride shattered. You have the Strait of Hormuz being opened and closed like a faucet, depending on the mood in Tehran. And right in the center of all of it, you have American military aircraft, American weapons, American pilots, and American strategic intention landing on Israeli soil. This is not charity. This is not a coincidence. This is coordinated geopolitical architecture being built right before your eyes, and the blueprints are hiding in plain sight. The real question isn't what the planes are carrying. The real question is what they represent, and more importantly, what comes next, and whether the American people are being told the full truth about the role their nation is now playing in reshaping the entire power structure of the Middle East. Because if you follow the trail, not the sound bites, not the press releases, but the actual decisions being made at the highest levels of power, what you find is something far deeper, far more deliberate, and far more consequential than anything the evening news is willing to tell you. So let's talk about it properly. To understand what these 5 cargo planes mean, you have to understand the architecture of the relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv that has been quietly, methodically reconstructed since Donald Trump returned to power in January of 2025. From the very first weeks of his second term, Trump signed a national security presidential memorandum restoring his maximum pressure policy against Iran. That was the signal. Not the cargo planes, not the carrier strike groups. That one signature in early February of 2025 was the declaration of intent, and everything you are watching now is the downstream consequence of that decision. Trump's maximum pressure policy directed the Department of the Treasury to impose maximum economic sanctions on Iran and the Department of State to lead a campaign aimed at driving Iranian oil exports to zero. And when you push a country's economy to the edge like that, when you cut off its oil revenues, when you strangle its financial system, you are not seeking a negotiated resolution, you are creating the conditions for collapse or confrontation. Those are the only 2 exits from that corridor. And what we have seen unfold over the past year and a half is the confrontation pathway being activated step by deliberate step. Now, people want to ask whether Trump was pulled into this by Netanyahu. Trump himself has been very vocal about denying that. Trump wrote in a social media post that Israel never talked me into the war with Iran, attributing his position to the results of October 7th combined with what he called his lifelong opinion that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. And look, you can believe that or you can question it, but what matters more than who persuaded whom is the question of who benefits, who is bearing the cost, and who is being asked to die for it. Because those 3 answers point in very different directions, and the American public deserves to sit with that discomfort for a moment before moving on to the next headline. Let's go back and trace this precisely. Beginning in late January 2026, the United States carried out its largest military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, deploying air, naval, and missile defense assets amid escalating tensions with Iran. Think about the scale of what that sentence actually says. The largest military buildup since 2003. Since Iraq, and we all remember what came after 2003, we all remember the promises made then about weapons, about threats, about national security. We all remember how that story ended with trillions of dollars spent, thousands of American lives lost, an entire region destabilized for a generation. So when you hear largest buildup since 2003, that is not a casual statistic. That is a historical alarm bell ringing with the full force of lived experience behind it. And yet here we are, watching it unfold again, and the conversation in Washington is not about restraint, it is about positioning. On February 28, 2026, this culminated in a series of joint military strikes in Iran by the United States and Israel, sparking the 2026 Iran war. Joint strikes. That word, joint, is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, because joint means American pilots in the sky. Joint means American ordnance hitting Iranian soil. Joint means the United States is not a passive observer providing defensive equipment to an ally. It means the United States is a full participant in an offensive military campaign against a sovereign nation. And the American people, by and large, were never asked about this. There was no congressional declaration of war. There was no national debate. There was a decision made in a room, and then there were planes in the air, and then there were explosions, and then there was a war. Netanyahu told ABC News that American pilots are shooting down drones aimed at Israeli cities alongside Israeli pilots, and that 2 THAAD batteries based in Israel and Aegis ships are helping defend against missiles, for which he expressed deep appreciation. Now notice how Netanyahu frames this. He frames it as help. He frames it as generosity. He frames American military involvement as something Israel received rather than something America chose. And that framing is important because it shapes the narrative. It positions Israel as the beneficiary and America as the patron, when the actual strategic and financial relationship is considerably more complex than that. Let's talk about what these cargo planes are carrying and what that tells us about the depth of the commitment. Dozens of U.S. cargo planes have recently delivered heavy weapons and munitions to Israel, including Mk-84 bombs and interceptor missiles for the U.S. THAAD air defense system, transported by C-17 airlifters to Nevatim Air Base in southern Israel. Mk-84 bombs are 2,000-pound general-purpose bombs. These are not defensive weapons. These are offensive munitions of enormous destructive power, and they are being shipped to Israel in the middle of an active war with Iran. Boeing KC-135 refueling aircraft and C-17 Globemaster transport planes were documented at Ben Gurion Airport as this military relationship has continued to deepen. The logistics of this operation are staggering when you actually stop and count them. Since the start of Israel's operation against Iran, 14 cargo planes with equipment for the IDF have landed in Israel, joining 800 others that have arrived since the beginning of the war, with the vast majority coming from the US, 800 planes. The American logistics machine has been running at full capacity for Israel throughout this conflict, and the number keeps climbing. Now here is where it gets geopolitically interesting in a way that most commentators are not fully exploring. According to the Institute for National Security Studies, more than 200 U.S. fighter jets are currently in the Middle East, and more than 300 including those stationed in Europe, including 36 F-15 aircraft, at least 48 F-35 stealth jets, 12 F-22 stealth jets stationed in Britain, and 36 F-16 aircraft in the region, 300 American fighter jets within range of the Middle Eastern theater. That is not a defensive posture, that is a war posture. That is the posture of a nation that has fully committed its military prestige and its kinetic power to a particular strategic outcome. And you have to ask yourself, what is that outcome? What does the end state look like? What does America actually want from all of this? Because the answer to that question is not as simple as prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. That was the stated rationale, the public justification. But stated rationales in geopolitics are rarely the full story. They are the part of the story that is designed for public consumption. Trump's own intelligence chief, Tulsi Gabbard, complicated the official narrative significantly. Gabbard testified to Congress in March that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. Let that sink in. The Director of National Intelligence testified before Congress that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and yet the war on Iran was justified to the American public on the basis of preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. The contradiction between those two facts is not a minor discrepancy. It is a fundamental question about the basis on which American military power was mobilized, and it deserves far more attention than it has received in the mainstream press. Trump said he was thinking of sending a second aircraft carrier to the Middle East, joining the U.S. Armada already in the region that could bolster a strike on Iran if bilateral talks failed. 2 carrier strike groups. The firepower represented by 2 American carrier strike groups is almost impossible to overstate. Each carrier group travels with cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and its own air wing of roughly 70 aircraft. 2 of them in the same theater signals a level of American military commitment that goes beyond deterrence. That is coercive power being deployed at maximum intensity. And what about the economic dimension of all this? Because wars are never just military events. They are economic events. They are financial events. They are market events. Iran announced it was closing the Strait of Hormuz during this conflict, and even temporary closure of the strait sends oil prices into convulsions that ripple through every economy on the planet. The Strait of Hormuz is the passage through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows every single day. When Iran closes it, or even threatens to close it, you are looking at energy market disruptions that affect the gas prices American families pay at the pump, the cost of goods they buy at the grocery store, the heating bills they receive in winter. The war in the Middle East is not an abstraction for Americans. It has a price, and ordinary Americans are paying it even if they don't see the direct connection. Since the Hamas attacks on October 7, 2023, the US has provided at least $16.3 billion in direct military aid to Israel, $16.3 billion, that is American taxpayer money. And then on top of that, an $8.6 billion deal was announced by the Pentagon for Israel to receive at least 25 F-15 fighter jets, announced shortly after Netanyahu and Trump met in Florida. $8.6 billion for 25 fighter jets. Jets that can carry hypersonic weapons. Jets that have a greater payload capacity than any other fighter aircraft currently in service. And these were announced immediately after a Trump-Netanyahu meeting, which tells you something important about the rhythm of this relationship. The diplomatic meeting followed immediately by the military procurement announcement, followed by the cargo planes. This is a pipeline, not a series of separate events. It is a continuous coordinated flow of American military power into Israeli hands. The Pentagon is constructing aircraft facilities in Israel to accommodate new KC-46A Pegasus refueling tanker planes, with Army Corps of Engineers documents showing new buildings being constructed and existing ones upgraded at a military base in southern Israel. The Pentagon is literally building infrastructure on Israeli soil, permanent-looking infrastructure, hangars, warehouses, storage facilities. The kind of infrastructure you build when you are planning to be somewhere for a long time. And the KC-46 tanker is specifically significant because its primary military purpose is to extend the range of strike aircraft. Its purpose is to allow fighter jets to fly further and strike targets that would otherwise be out of reach. The purchase of KC-46As was seen as a signal of Israel's determination to increase its capacity to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. So you have the United States building on Israeli soil the infrastructure needed to extend Israeli striking range against Iranian targets with American taxpayer money and American military expertise. This is not a bilateral relationship between equal partners managing a shared threat. This is something else entirely. Now let's talk about what Trump and Netanyahu actually decided together, because the private conversations are as important as the public statements. Trump and Netanyahu discussed the possibility of new strikes on Iran in 2026 at a meeting at Mar-a-Lago on December 29, 2025, with Trump indicating he would likely support such strikes if the US finds that Iran is taking concrete steps to restore its nuclear program. So by the end of December 2025, Trump and Netanyahu were already sitting together at Mar-a-Lago discussing the timeline and conditions for the next round of strikes. This was not reactive, this was not improvised, this was pre-planned, condition-based military action being discussed between two heads of state at a private resort, away from congressional oversight, away from public scrutiny, away from the kind of democratic deliberation that is supposed to precede the commitment of American military force. And now we are in April of 2026, and Trump says that extension of a ceasefire with Iran is highly unlikely, while simultaneously signals are being sent about potential new negotiations. The diplomatic door is being held slightly ajar, while the military door remains wide open. This is a classic pressure strategy. Keep the target uncertain about whether relief is possible while continuing to apply maximum force. And caught in the middle of that strategy are Iranian civilians, American military personnel, energy markets, regional economies, and the broader architecture of international law that has governed how nations relate to one another since the end of World War II. Netanyahu himself said Israel dealt a heavy blow to Iran's regime of terror and strengthened Israel's position as a regional power, crediting the courageous decisions made during what he called the War of Revival. That language, War of Revival, is extraordinarily loaded. It is not the language of strategic necessity. It is the language of civilizational mission. And when leaders begin using civilizational language to describe military campaigns, the scope of what they are willing to do tends to expand dramatically because the mission is no longer bounded by tactical objectives. It becomes bounded only by the horizon of the civilization itself. What we are watching, in real time, is a reordering of the Middle East's power structure. Iran's air defenses have been severely degraded. Its nuclear program has been targeted. Its regional proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, have been severely weakened. The axis of resistance that Iran spent decades and billions of dollars constructing has been systematically dismantled, and the United States, through 5 cargo planes, through 800 cargo planes, through carrier strike groups, through THAAD batteries, through American pilots in the sky over Israeli cities, has been the engine driving that dismantling. The question of whether this serves American national interests, genuinely, concretely, measurably, is one that demands an honest answer. The question of who paid for it, who fought it, and who will live with its consequences for the next generation is one that belongs to the American people. And the very fact that those questions are not being asked loudly enough, in enough rooms, by enough voices, is itself something worth paying very close attention to.